Okay, welcome everybody to week 6 of Psych 3500 Tests and Measurements. Alrighty, so for this week, we will be getting into chapter 8, and let's proceed. Alrighty, folks, let's get into a particularly interesting chapter in our text that concerning individual tests of cognitive abilities. Okay, a big focus for us here will be on describing the characteristics of individual tests of cognitive abilities, mental abilities, right? Most typically associated with the IQ test. And we will look particularly at the characteristics of the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. Okay, the WAIS, which is currently in its 4th version. I have WAIS 3 here on this slide, but it's actually currently in its 4th, the 5th to be coming out probably within months. Alrighty, and it is the most used IQ test on the planet. Alrighty, the next is the Stanford Binet, which some of you may have heard the term, let's say in developmental psych, human development, or intro psych, and related courses. Okay. So what are some of the characteristics of an cognitive ability test? Okay, whether it's the Wechsler or Stanford, or we'll talk about other cognitive ability tests as well. Okay. Well, first of all, administering a test is no simple manner, yeah, because these tests usually involve several tasks. Okay, for the WAIS, it has 15 subtests. Each test is done differently and has to be administered in a slightly different manner. Okay, it's not like the SAT where you could just pass a hard copy paper book, or now online in many cases, to an individual, and they could just take it at the computer or take it at their desk. Alrighty, it involves active participation and involvement of the examiner. Okay, in asking questions, in laying out the tasks before the examinee. But also a real big part is that scoring occurs while the examinee is giving responses. Yeah? And based on the scores, yeah, the examiner presents different tasks, or will start or end a particular subtest earlier or later, depending on the answers that are given. Okay, so you need an actively involved examiner administering these types of tests. Okay. Now, they also tend to cover a wide range of abilities, verbal, visual, spatial. We'll get into all the different cognitive abilities that the IQ test assesses. Yeah, and it's done so across the lifespan. So there's an actual separate test for with the WAIS, a separate test for infants, for children, and then for adults, and then different norms are applied depending on the age of the examinee. Another big important piece of doing really good IQ testing is establishing rapport, making sure that the person is relatively relaxed at the task. And I say relatively because taking an IQ test is anxiety provoking, right? The whole notion of your intellectual mental muscle ability being scored is going to be anxiety provoking for the vast majority of people. If it isn't anxiety provoking, probably something's wrong. All right. Most people feel a little anxious. Some can feel a ton of anxiety, and if they're really anxious, it's going to preclude you're doing a test, right? Because you won't get a good measurement of what they're capable of. Okay? But if they're, moderately anxious, right, a little nervous, that's fine. Yeah, and because that actually is generalizable, right, to a real situation where someone's faced with something that they're unfamiliar with, that's a challenge, right, and so on. So being, moderately anxious is absolutely fine, and it, it's part and parcel of the test. Okay. Many of the tasks asked in an IQ test tend to use a free response format. Yeah, an unstructured response format. So allowing the examinee to expand on her or his answers or explain their answers, right? And this can actually go to affecting scoring. All right, so it's not just like true, false, or multiple choice where the scantron is just going to go beep and give you a particular score. You need the examiner to really fully understand, what your response is. Okay? And there's actually a script as to when and how the examiner may make a query as to, what you meant by an answer, so that she or he can really understand, what your response was, so that they can give you the appropriate score. Okay. Taking an IQ test usually takes I wrote here about an hour, but really in most cases it'll take about an hour and a half to 2 hours. In some cases, depending on the individual, if they're particularly nervous, and so on, or they suffer from some kind of medical or other psychiatric um, condition that precludes their being able to sit still for like 90 to 120 minutes. Sometimes it may be done across 2 or 3 sessions. All righty, that's a legitimate administration of the IQ test, given those particular types of circumstances. Okay, and the other strength of an IQ test is that it allows for clinical observation of how the individual is performing the task. So it's not just, getting responses and scoring them, but qualifying overall IQ performance based on, or IQ performance on a cognitive performance on a specific task, by observing the examinee's behaviors. Yeah, how are they approaching the task? How did they try to problem solve? Yeah. So the most common IQ test is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, developed by David Wechsler in the 1950s. And what's important when understanding the WAIS, as it's known by its acronym, is David Wechsler's conceptualization, or you could say theory, of what intelligence was or is. David Wechsler isn't around now, so it's past tense, but it's still that theory that underlies the structure of the test. Yeah. So for Wechsler, his conceptualization of intelligence was it involves, whatever intelligence is, it involves the ability to act purposefully when confronted with a particular task, to think rationally or logically, and also, right, this kind of has an evolutionary flavor, to be able to deal effectively with one's environment. All righty, and this includes not only the physical environment, but social environment as well. Now, the current version with the WAIS 4 is composed of 15 subtests. We'll look at those subtests in just a moment. Okay. Now, 12 of those subtests were actually transferred or retained from the WAIS 3, from the prior version. But 3 unused subtests were included, including visual puzzles, figure weights, and cancellation. Now, here's a listing of all 15 tests in the WAIS 4. Okay. Now, many of these actually carry over from the original WAIS, WAIS 1, and from WAIS 2. What I put in parentheses were those subtests which came about in the 3rd and now in the current version. Yeah. So matrix reasoning was not in 1 and 2, but it was developed for WAIS 3, and same thing with symbol search. But visual puzzles came about in the WAIS 4. Yeah, so you can see the majority of the subtests are actually the same subtests from the original WAIS, which was developed in the 50s. Okay. The specific items may have been revised, to take out test bias and those kinds of issues. But the subtests themselves, the majority, are from the original WAIS. Now, when it comes to IQ, okay, IQ being an acronym for intelligence quotient. Okay. The idea in the WAIS is that you can produce different types of IQ. Okay. One is the full scale overall IQ, which what most people associate when they hear about someone's IQ score. All righty. But you can also break down IQ into 4 types of IQ. Yeah, and here we have a verbal comprehension, formerly just called verbal IQ. It has to deal with word knowledge, use, and so on. Verbal reasoning, okay, logical reasoning. There's also perceptual reasoning, formerly known as performance IQ, which relates to visual spatial abilities, less verbally based, more visually based on visual spatial information. Okay. Very often associated with the idea of being more culture free. Okay, I kind of hesitated with that because you should hesitate with the concept of notion of culture free, because the reality is every test, right, as much test bias may not exist from a statistical level, yeah, or but will still have culture in it, yeah, based on the format, whether it's hard copy or on a computer, if it's puzzles, particular words chosen, yeah, even if it doesn't demonstrate test bias, right? There's always culture underlying the structure and the content of a test. Every test, there's no such thing as an absolutely culture-free test. Okay. Uh, two other types of IQs include working memory and processing speed. Okay. Now, the first test we're going to talk about here, we're going to talk about most of the subtests in the WAIS. And the examples I'm going to use are going to come from the WAIS-R, or the second version of the WAIS. Okay, that's the one I was trained on back in 1989. All righty. But been revised now a couple times, and the fifth one coming out in within the year. All righty. Well, let's look at some of the major subtests. So we're going to go over not all the subtests in the WAIS-4, but the major ones using examples from the WAIS-R. Okay, and that's probably fine for me to do. What becomes more of an issue is if I used actual items from the current WAIS-4. All righty. Although there may have been some there is some overlap, but from prior WAIS versions to the current one, many of them have been revised to take into account our cultural applicability, and so on. Alrighty, so the task with picture completion is the subject sees a series of pictures from a little booklet, and like this, and they see a picture, and the instruction is very simple. It's just, what is the most essential thing missing from this picture? Okay. Now they are not timed on this, right? So you just ask them and you wait for the examiner to provide an answer. Right? And based on the answer, they're given a different type of score, okay, which will get, I think there's scored from a 1 to 2, 0, completely wrong, 1 if they get some part of it correct, and then 2 if they get the complete correct answer. Okay, so we're just going to bypass this and we'll go over this when we meet face to face. Okay, we'll just okay. So the next, so what does picture completion measure? Okay, and I actually have to take it back. I think picture completion, you're only scored 0 and 1. I don't think there's a partial credit for it. Okay, with picture completion, what does it measure? It measures the examinee's ability to discern, tell the difference between essential versus non-essential information, all righty, which is so critical to our functioning, right? When we're walking about in public, when we're confronted with a problem in a text, right? We want to, the ability to focus in on the essential aspects of a problem versus non-essential is really critical. Right? And some would argue, most of life is knowing all the stuff we don't need to know, but focusing on the stuff that is essential to solve a problem. Okay. Related to that is the area of alertness. So picture completion, based on if you got a low high score, it measures one's ability to be alert or in contact with current circumstances. Okay. Now, when interpreting subtest score performance, okay, we, as I mentioned before, IQ, right? There's full scale IQ, overall IQ, the 4 sub IQs. Yeah. There are also scores that go to each subtest. All righty, resulting in a kind of a subtest profile where someone can have low and high scores, or a whole bunch of high, a whole bunch of low scores on the different subtests. Okay. Now, the subtest scatter, or the variability in performance being low and high, is often really critical for the psychologist. Okay, and for many psychologists, more critical than overall IQ. I mean, unless it's significantly high or significantly low. Yeah, and as you're probably well familiar, most of us tend to perform in the average range, right? 60% of us, and 95% of us perform one or two standard deviations above and below the mean. That's 95% of us, right? So average, and certainly it's important to know if you're above average or below average. Yeah, but it's very often the subtest scatter that is particularly informative. Yeah, for things like differential diagnosis, occupational treatment planning, and so on. Now, the way to interpret subtest scatter or a profile performance, yeah, is by comparing the subtest performance with other subtests. Yeah, I kind of suggested that already. The way you do that is by looking at, obviously, the subtest score. So what you do is once you score the subject's performance on a particular subtest, yeah, you get the raw score. Okay, you then by looking into the manual, the testing score manual, you find out its standard score, right? Its standardized score, right? And then you take that standardized score and it allows you now to compare, just like in our previous discussion about standardized scores, it now allows you to compare that score with the other subtest standardized scores. Okay, now there are a couple other ways that this is done too, very commonly. Okay, the most general way is by finding out what the mean subtest standard score is. Okay, and then seeing how much that someone varies on a particular subtest. So, as a general matter, subtests on the IQ test have a mean of 10 with a standard deviation of 3. Okay, so if someone, let's just say on picture completion, got a 14, you know they're above one standard deviation on picture completion, meaning that they're really strong on that. They're above average. If they got a 6, then you know they're below average on that, right? Because if mean of 10 with a standard deviation of 3, the cutoff is 7, right? Below that is below one standard deviation. Right? Also, you know that's a weakness of theirs. So that's one way to do it. Another way is to compare the individual subtest standardized score with their verbal vocabulary. That's another subtest standardized score. Okay, very common way. So those are some of the general ways that it's done. Mean and standard deviation comparison, looking for the comparison of the subtest standardized score with the person's average score, or so you can look at the population, right? That the population mean is 10 and the standard deviations, or you can look at the examinee's average and compare how she or he does compared to their own average subtest performance, or the third is by comparing their subtest performance with their vocabulary performance. Now, if someone does poorly in picture completion, it's usually it will suggest, poor perceptual organizational abilities. It also could be an indication of poor emotional control, yeah, or some kind of emotional disturbance going on. Now, if they get a really high picture completion performance, right, it may be suggested, first of all, that they're just very strong in being able to discern important from unnecessary things. It could also relate to obsessive compulsive tendencies. Okay. It doesn't necessarily mean one or the other of these weaknesses or strengths, but that you can only really determine by looking at the performance on other tests, as well as through your clinical interview, which you probably conducted beforehand, to find out how they're doing in school and in work and so on. Okay, so that's picture completion. The next test is vocabulary. Now, vocabulary, what the examinee is given, they're given a card with a list of, I think, 40 to 50 words, all righty? And the examiner tells them that, I'm going to read off some words, and I'd like you to tell me what they mean. That's it. That's the instruction. That's the kind of the beauty of the IQ test. Is very simple and straightforward, although it can get a really incredible complexity of information about the examinee's cognitive functioning. So you ask them, for example, what does winter mean? Right? And they give you a definition, and their score, again, as mentioned earlier, will vary depending on, can vary from a 0, 1, or 2, depending on the quality of their answer. Right? And the WACE manual provides a scoring key, right? So you can score them a 0, 1, or 2, depending on their answer to each of the words. As I mentioned to you before as well, if they make a certain number of errors, like I think it's about 2 or 3 errors, that you stop the test. Okay, it's usually 2 or 3 errors, I think, in a row, and then you stop the test. Okay, you don't go on to the very end. Alrighty. So with that, we'll go over a couple of the words and the answers when we meet face to face, but I'm just going to kind of bypass that and go right into a discussion about what vocabulary measures. Okay, it is probably the #1 subtest to get an assessment or estimate of overall IQ functioning. All right, it's the one most correlated with overall IQ. I think usually like 0.5, 0.6, pretty high. Yeah, I may be underestimating that. As I mentioned before, it's usually because it's so highly correlated with overall IQ, it's usually used as a point of comparison with other subtests. As mentioned before with picture completion, if they do high or low, right, there are different things possible, things to hypothesize, possible interpretations. If they do really low compared to the mean on the rest of their tests, which would be really odd because vocabulary tends to be the best measure, but it's always possible, right? And let's just say on all the other subtests, they average a 10, but on vocabulary, they get a 5 or 4. Very odd. It could indicate that they're actually really bright, that kind of circumstance, but they come from an impoverished environment. Yeah, let's just say they came from multiple foster care homes and they were constantly dropping out of school because of problems. And because of that, that just interrupted what may be a very bright person's abilities from actually acquiring a good vocabulary or reading, a comprehension and so on. Now, which would invariably be related to vocabulary. Now, also because it's so unusual for vocabulary to be significantly lower than the mean on the other tests, it may be a sign of some kind of organicity, some kind of brain dysfunction. Alrighty, it's not a rule, and you certainly would have no place to diagnose someone as suffering from having brain damage based on a low vocabulary score compared to their other WACE subtest scores. But it's certainly a red flag. And that's a hypothesis to keep in mind. Now, what if they do okay or poorly on average with the subtest, but they do significantly higher compared to their overall subtest performance, but they do significantly higher in vocabulary? That's also kind of odd too, because vocabulary being so significantly correlated with overall IQ, you shouldn't have a disparity like that. But if you do, it could be a sign of over-intellectualizing on the part of the examinee. To put it quite simply, the examinee trying to come off brighter than they really are. They might try to get at every single word and take a lot of time thinking of every single possibility until they finally get a right answer because they want to come across as smarter than they may actually be. The other is that it may be suggestive of OCD tendencies. It could be. Again, it's not a rule-in, right? It depends on a number of circumstances, including the performance on other subtests on the WACE. Okay, another subtest, really good. Well, they're all really good. They're really well constructed and they really are well validated and show good reliabilities. The other subtest is similarities. Now, similarities, just like all the other subtests, the instructions are very straightforward. You tell the subject that you're going to say 2 words and you want the subject to tell them how they are similar. Okay? So for example, you tell the subject, how are an orange and banana alike? Alrighty. And then I think there are about 15 to 20 pairs you go through. Okay. And again, after a couple errors in a row, you would stop the testing. Okay. So you don't go through all 20, you might stop at 10 or 15, depending on the examinee's performance. And based on the answers they give, right, they can get a 0, 1, or 2 based on the WACE manual. And we'll get into that a little later. Now, what does similarities measure? Okay. Now, now next to the test, I didn't mention this before. You'll see a letter V, or you won't. If you see the letter V, that means that this is a verbally based test. Alrighty, vocabulary was a verbally based test. Picture completion, more of a performance test, a visual spatial test. Yeah, for maybe some obvious reasons. So similarities as a verbal test, what does it measure? Or it particularly measures more so than vocabulary, abstract reasoning. Okay, so when like orange banana, like that question, right? Then the 2-point answer is that they're both fruit. Alrighty, and with subsequent pairings, what the test is trying to discern is the examinee's ability to abstract, right? To see, okay, what's the larger non-concrete category that these two words belong to? Alrighty, do they belong to the category all living things, or and so on? Alrighty, can they? So in other words, can the person find the abstract categories that explain the or that connect how two stimuli are alike? Right? Related to this is logical reasoning, right? Because there's obviously some kind of um, reasoning through of how things are alike or not alike, and so on, how they fit a category, right? So it's not just memorizing categories and so on, alrighty? And the examiner shouldn't anticipate that, right? Because the examinee shouldn't be anticipating what's going to be on the IQ test. All right. Although regrettably, in the internet age, a number of these items are already floating around out there. Okay. You just gotta bank on, or you can ask the client if they've ever, seen any of the IQ test items or other psychological test items on the internet. Odds are most of them are going to say no because they never searched for it. Where you might have to suspect that someone searched for it is if you're doing a testing for forensic reasons and you suspect the examinee might want to come across in a certain manner, okay? That's fair game to ask them in the interview, okay? And you would judge based on their response how credible they are when they say no, they're not familiar with the items or that they are, okay? Now, similar with interpretations as with vocabulary and picture completion, there are different ways you can interpret a low or high score. Okay? If they're poor in similarities compared to the other subtests, clearly it's related to poor, well, logically, based on what I just described, what the test measures, it may be a sign of low abstract reasoning, right? The more concrete. Yeah. And this is maybe a good time to kind of revisit our understanding of what concrete versus abstract reasoning is. Yeah? As a general matter, you can think of concrete reasoning as based on the physical characteristics of a phenomenon or phenomena, right? So, for example, when what would be a concrete problem? So maybe a concrete problem is seeing an item and it being divided into different parts, right? And then maybe into 3 parts, and then spacing them out, and then trying to understand whether they take up more space or not, right? And your ability to determine whether it takes up more space or not, you can see, right, is the same object. It's just cut into 3 pieces and it doesn't take up any more space, right? And how can you tell that? By the physical characteristics of the object, right? The object is going to get bigger, it just got cut up, and you can still visually see the pieces, right? So examining the physical characteristics, and that's how you're reasoning that it's not larger, right, or more, something that is now greater in space, right? Because you can see it's not taking up more space. It's the same object, just in different pieces. Okay, an abstract concept is a concept that's not bound by the physical characteristics of the construct. Yeah. So, for example, if you wanted to talk about why it, why killing a police officer or a judge holds a higher murder penalty, right? That's you very in most states that tends to be first-degree murder, among other things, right? If it was planned and heinous. Another one is if it's a judge or police officer, right? That in many states that counts as first-degree murder. And in understanding that, right, you have to get to a discussion, kind of moral reasoning about, how not how judges and police officers aren't inherently better or superior as people, but what they do and what they represent is important to society. Yeah, so that if someone goes out and shoots a judge, right, we go, hey, that's particularly bad. That's a worse crime, and it's falls into that category of a murder one, right, first degree murder. And that concept of justice, or I guess weighing in the social implications, right? You can't see that, right? But you understand. So your reasoning about its importance doesn't have to do with the judge being bigger or smaller, right? Or ugly or attractive, right? Not on the physical characteristics. It's based on something we can't see, right? The judge's importance to society, a judge's, right? Well, with that, so that's, yeah, just want to draw out the distinction between concrete versus abstract reasoning. If they do particularly low, it may also be related to a psychotic thought process, right? Very often in those suffering from schizophrenia, they have trouble with abstract reasoning. Yeah, their thinking becomes far more concrete, yeah? So if you ask them how our chair and table like, instead of saying furniture, someone with schizophrenia may be more likely to say there are things in your room. I mean, yeah, it might be correct. It might be in their room or somebody's room, but that's a very concrete answer, right? Because they've seen that before. It's not understanding, how they're essentially like. Well, how they're essentially like is in terms of the category. They're both furniture. Okay. And just like vocabulary, if someone's similarities is way super duper higher than all their other subtest scores or most of their subtest scores, it may be an attempt at intellectualizing. Okay, another subtest is block design. Okay, what block design is, you're given blocks that look like these. Each block is either all red on one side or all white on one side and half red, half white on some sides. Alrighty, so you're given several of those, and your task is to arrange them to form certain designs like this. Okay, you get a little booklet, you're shown different designs, and you're to arrange the blocks to resemble the design that they see. Now, what does this task measure? Okay, it measures one's ability to, by way of visual spatial means, determine part-whole relationships. Yeah, so understanding how this is just a part of the whole here, and these are two subparts of the whole, and how they relate, right? That this comes at an angle to these two red blocks. Okay. It also relates to visual motor organization. And motor, because when you're putting these together, you're putting them together with your hands, right? So are you able to take that information and then by thinking about solving the problem, then use your hands to move the pieces accordingly. Okay, two separate abilities. Now, this is a good time for me to mention a concept in testing called testing the limits. Okay, now what you can do after you first administer the test pursuant to the test manual instructions, that's what you need to do, right? It's a standardized test. You have to administer it the same way to all examinees. Now, after you've done that, before you proceed with the next subtest, yeah, what you can do, maybe you can take a little break between subtests, is you can ask the person if they seem to be having trouble with the block designs, right? You can ask them, to, hey, let's go back to some of the one of the earlier designs, right? Show them the picture, yeah, and then maybe without moving their hands, just say, hey, could you describe to me, how you would solve this puzzle? What blocks would go where, right? And maybe if they verbally describe it, right, as opposed to trying to solve it with the using their hands like a puzzle, right, on a coffee table, they may be able to come to a solution, And then that kind of tells you, the problem isn't what their ability to visualize it in their head. The disconnect occurs when they have that picture in their head, but then they try to, have their brain then, tell their hands what to do. That motor coordination seems to be what the problem is. Yeah, so you're kind of testing the limits or of what the test can do by, almost breaking the test into like parts. So you can see exactly what part the person is having difficulty with. Okay? And we'll go through some of these a little later, perhaps. Um, Next subtest is arithmetic, the arithmetic subtest. Now, what arithmetic is very simple, is the examiner reading off fairly straightforward math problems, nothing complex, no algebra, as I recall, geometry, anything like that, just very simple math problems, okay? Now, the person is told, they're not given any paper or pencil. They're just told to, that they're going to be read some that the examiner is going to read off some problems, and then the subject is to come up with the answer. Oh, just take a little break-a-rooney. Excuse me, thank you. So, question might be, raffle tickets cost 25 cents each. How much would it cost to buy 6 tickets? Okay, here the answer is $1.50. Alrighty, so what does the arithmetic subtest measure? Okay, what it measures besides arithmetic ability is the ability to concentrate and attend to a situation, right? So attention is like alertness, right? It's to what extent you are connected with the environment, and to what extent to which you're attending to stimuli, auditory stimuli, verbal stimuli, and so on and so on. Concentration refers to your ability to then use that information and work with it, right? So when you're figuring, okay, 25 cents times 6, right? Might say times 4 is $1, and then another, times 2 is 50 cents, $1.50. Now, someone does poorly on this, it may certainly relate to poor math skills. You might want to find out in the clinical interview or afterwards, if you didn't get to it in the clinical interview, right, what their math experience has been like. Alrighty. This subtest also is a kind of a good measure too about overall anxiety. Yeah. So again, and as mentioned previously, this might be a time you might want to use your clinical observational skills to see just how nervous the person is. I mean, really, just down to are their hands shaking? Do they seem to be looking at you? Is eye contact good? How about their breathing? All that kind of stuff. Okay. And after doing this test, if you think anxiety is an issue, it might be time for a break in the test if you didn't have one before. Alrighty. And maybe try to chat with the examinee about how they're feeling about the test so far, and try to allay some of their anxieties. Yeah. And then if they do super well, again, it may not be so much an indication of their math abilities, but it may be an indication of OCD tendencies, right? Because this test, like many of the tests, you are not timed on. So the examinee can take up as much time or say as much stuff as they want to until they finally hit it. Now, the funny thing is that now I've given a few dozen of these IQ tests, and most examinees, they'll give you an answer like in a sentence or two, and then that's it, and then you move on to the next item. It's just very interesting. Most people do that. But every now and then you run into somebody who, because they know it's not time, right, because you tell them, right, or they don't see a stopwatch or anything, so they figure it's not time, they just go on and on and on until, they get a sense that they finally got it, okay? Which, again, could be indicative of OCD. Okay, the next test is digit span. Now, the way digit span works is, as an examiner, you tell the examinee that you're going to read off some numbers, like 2, 4, and they're supposed to repeat them after you. Okay, so I'm going to say some numbers, 2, 4, and then they go 2, 4. The example is not the same as what you actually give them, by the way. And then you score them based on, if they got them right. And I think just like with some other subtests, after they get 2 in a row incorrect, you stop. All righty. Now with digit span, with each, after they get 1 correct, okay, or 1 error, the next you go through each succeeding digit span question. Each digit span question or inquiry adds another digit to the task. Okay, so this is something we'll go over together when we meet face to face. So we'll just kind of go right through this. You also, that's digit span forward. There's also digit span backwards. Alrighty. Now the way that works is, as you can imagine, whole lot of fun, is the examiner says, I'm going to read some numbers to you, and I'd like you to say them to me backwards. And what's kind of fun is about a third of examinees always go, oh, you got me, mister. But, a lot of people, if they did fine on forwards, they usually do fine backwards. Alrighty, so you say, I'm going to say a number like 2, 4, and what would you say? And they usually get it 4, 2. Okay, but similarly, with each inquiry, you're adding a digit. Alrighty, which becomes a whole lot of fun for the examinee, but we'll just kind of blast right through this. Now, what does digit span measure? Okay, well, what it measures when you're doing the first type of digit span, forwards, is attention. All right, there's no concentration. It's just you're saying 2, 4, and then they go 2, 4. Right. However, with the second task where they say, hear you, but they have to say the numbers backwards, it's not only a measure of attention, but also concentration, because they're working with that information, right? It's the simplest task, right? So you give them 5, 5, 5, 8, and you go 8, 5, right? But that simple task of retaining that information, but then reversing it and saying it backwards is a measure of concentration, because now you're dealing with working with what you're remembering. Okay? So it's also overall a good measure of short-term memory, right? That memory for information, how long is short-term memory? About 15, 40 seconds, something like that. Now, if they do particularly low, it could be a sign of high distractibility. Right? So someone with ADHD might not do so well on the subtest. Again, if they get a low score, much like the math one, it's a good measure or litmus test of anxiety. But if they do super high compared to their other subtests, it's kind of odd that they would. Right? It could be related to very unusual clinical circumstances, but a bland or flat affect, right? Where they seem to be disconnected from their emotions, because those who are disconnected from the emotions probably will do much better than most people on this task, because this isn't, the whole test and each subtest is anxiety provoking in its own way. But this one in particular. Another subtest is called information. Now, the way information works, again, very simple instructions. You tell the examinee, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'd like you to just answer them. So first one is, how many weeks are there in a year? 52. And then other information related questions. I think there are, again, about 20 to 30. And we'll just kind of blast through these. What does information measure? Another verbally based test. It measures fund of knowledge. Yeah, so how much you've learned in school, facts and figures, word knowledge, stuff of that sort. It's a real also indicator of early environmental experiences. Yeah, much as like with education and so on. Could be an index of educational materials or stimuli in the home, like the presence of books and so on. Okay, this is probably the second best subtest to correlate with overall IQ. Numero uno is vocabulary. This is number 2, highly correlated. Okay, so if you're in a burning building and you only have time to give one test, give the vocabulary test. I don't know why you'd continue doing an IQ test in a burning building, but just go with it. But if you're at a part of the hospital where you think the fire will take a little longer to get to you and you think you have time for 2 tests, this will be the second test you'd administer. Okay, very highly correlated with general intelligence. If they do poorly compared to the other subtests on information, it may be another indication of early environmental deprivation. Okay, maybe no access to um, internet resources, right? There's no computer or laptop in the home, books, and so on. Okay, if they do super duper well on this compared to the other subtests, like one or two of the other subtests, it could be a red flag that the person is just trying to come across smarter than they actually are. Okay. Now, comprehension, we had discussed one of the items, I think, one of these items in chapter 6, yeah? Or I might have really kind of just went past this one in our previous YouTube lecture. Be that as it may, comprehension is yet another subtest, okay? And it is a verbally based subtest where you ask the person several questions. I think they're more like 10 to 15. And the person is asked to provide an answer. But unlike information, where it's more, information is far more of whether you know a fact, like who is Louis Armstrong. This one kind of gets to your ability to reason, to logically solve something, yeah, to understand the basic underlying reasons for the way things are. Yeah. So one of the items from comprehension is why do we wash clothes? Okay. And like vocabulary, like information, and like similarities, right? The score is based on a 0, 1, 2 kind of scale. 0 for you got it completely wrong. 1 if you got some aspect of the answer correct, or 2 if you got the answer correct. Now, one of the things I didn't mention, this applies to many of the subtests we've already discussed and that we aren't covering, but very often in the manual, okay, besides giving the points and the right answers associated with those points, you'll often get things like what you got right here. Right? Next to a possible, okay, so 1 point, a 0 point response to this question is, it's a good thing to do because it's Monday. Oof, that's not a great answer to a question, why do you wash clothes? Because it's Monday? Alrighty, 0 points. No reference to cleaning or attractiveness. Okay. Now, so there are a couple things that the manual is looking for, right? If the person understands that cleaning is important, or, making clothes look nice is important as well. That's the underlying reason behind washing clothes. Keep them clean or make them look good, right? A 1 point response is that includes the idea of attractiveness, but not necessarily clean, just to say, yeah, to make my duds look good, right? If they say so they'll look good, right? They'll get 1 point, but in the manual, literally just straight from the manual, if there's a Q in parentheses, what this tells the examiner is that they can query the examinee. Yeah. In other words, they can kind of flesh out, hey, do you know more? It sounds like you might know more about this. So if the person says, they'll look good, you can ask them, well, what do you mean by that? And then they might say, well, they'll look good. It'll be clean. It won't have dirt on it. It's kind of stinky to just not wash your clothes, right? So then that seems more like a 2 point answer. A response which includes or strongly implies the idea of cleaning. Alrighty? So this relates to many of the subtests. The idea that not only are the points and the answers associated with those points given, but also based on the response, you may do a query. Now, if you notice here, you're not allowed to, right? If they say because it's Monday, that's it, right? Well, you don't go, that'd be wrong. You just quietly score them, right, in your scorebook that they got a 0 on that. Right? Because there's nothing here indicating that you can query them. But here, because it looks like they're kind of close to it, the manual tells you you can query them, right? By simply saying, hey, what do you mean by that? Could you expand on that? Could you explain that? And so on, right? It's following the rules of the manual, right? To query them after this is not following the rules. And arguably, if you do a bunch of that kind of stuff when administering the IQ test, you're invalidating the score. You're prompting them when they're not supposed to be getting prompts, or in other words, potentially helping them when they shouldn't. Well, actually, oddly enough, it could be worked the other way too, right? When you think about it, odds are you're probably helping them with the prompts, but really, when you think about it, it could go the other way too, right? The examiner could say, "Why are they always questioning my responses?" Right? And they get nervous or you get angry, and then they're not saying as much, so you could hurt them as well, right? The bottom line is, however they may feel one way or the other, if you stick to the standardized procedure, you can take the score and then apply it to the norms. If you don't, then it's questionable whether you can apply that score to the norms because the normative sample did it. Those scores are based on a standardized administration of this test. Here are a couple other questions. We'll probably look at that later. What does comprehension measure? It measures, as we kind of touched on already, judgment. Yeah. So are you able to make a good judgment when faced with a particular problem? How do you reason things through to come to your judgment or conclusion? If you score low on this one compared to the other tests, it may be a sign of impulsivity, right? Acting on emotion as opposed to thought. Yeah. It may also be related to a low score may be related to maladjustment, right? Again, right? Not being able to adjust, not being able to know the reasons for things and operate on your knowledge of how things work or why they work. Right? If you don't do that, right, you're not adjusting to society or your culture or the environment. All right, so that's it with our discussion about most of the subtests on the WACE. Let's talk about verbal versus performance IQ. Okay, those are the traditional IQs. There are two others, right? Memory as well as reaction time. So when it comes to IQ, yeah, if I didn't mention this before, IQ as a general matter has a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. Yeah, meaning that an average performance is between 85 and 115. If you do above that, right, you get a score of 120. You're technically above average. If you do lower than that, let's just say 110, that's technically below average. Alrighty. If you're two standard deviations below, right, 15 times 2 is 30, and 100 minus 30 is 70. Yeah. That's actually one of the criteria to be diagnosed as suffering from intellectual disability, or what was formerly known as mental retardation. Okay. One of the criteria. Right. In order to be diagnosed as suffering from an intellectual disability, you also need to be showing things such as an inability to, manage an apartment, to manage money, or to work, and so on. So it's not just IQ. Okay, you need to demonstrate disabilities and functioning in a few areas. Alrighty. So what now? That's overall IQ. Yeah, verbal performance IQs also have the same mean and standard deviation. Alrighty. But what this also kind of suggests is that verbal and performance IQ could be different. Okay. Now, if the difference is within 15 points, that's nothing too notable, right? Most people's verbal performance IQ will be within 15 points, 15 IQ points. Alrighty, and they'll usually be within one standard deviation, of their overall IQ. Now, what's kind of striking is when they're significantly different, and they're significantly different if they differ by more than 15 points. But what does it mean if one is significantly higher than the other? Well, it depends. Yeah, if verbal is significantly higher than performance, excuse me, one, it generally means obviously that their verbal abilities are stronger than the visual spatial ones. It may also it's also been associated in the past with what it's an archaic term, but with neurotic conditions, like anxiety disorders, mood disorders. This is also something that typically occurs in older individuals. Okay, not to say older individuals, excuse me, are more neurotic, depressed, or anxious than on average, but that older individuals, typically visual spatial abilities are more likely to diminish than verbal abilities. Yeah, so like your ability to discern essential from non-essential stuff, um, being able to look at a visual stimulus and know the essential thing that's missing. Those abilities tend to diminish far more than vocabulary and information, which tend to be fairly intact across time. Um, and if the verbal is significantly higher than performance, it's very commonly found among high academic achieving individuals. Okay. Now, if performance is significantly lower than verbal, clearly the visual spatial abilities are stronger than their verbal abilities, and you might want to think about, what implications that has in light of their prior educational work experiences. Some literature seems to suggest that sociopaths tend to have higher performance versus verbal abilities, but it doesn't work the other way around. It doesn't mean just because you have stronger performance versus visual abilities, verbal performance over verbal abilities, that means you're probably a sociopath. Doesn't mean that. There's just been some studies which have found that sociopaths tend to have higher performance versus verbal abilities. And it may be related to logical, moral reasoning. Okay. This is also maybe common among those people who don't do so well in school, but are really smart, right? They're good problem solvers. They can fix things well. And, the kind of people who consider themselves doers, but not thinkers. Okay. May demonstrate this kind of performance over verbal IQ kind of profile. Okay. Now, when looking at IQ, and the IQ test and its reliabilities. Yeah, one of the reasons why the WEX is so valued is because it demonstrates really strong reliability quotients, not quotients, but indices. Okay, in terms of test retest and internal reliability, full scale and verbal IQ is like in the 90s. Okay, that makes a test constructor quite happy. Visual spatial performance IQ is about in the 90s. Okay. Subtests, reliabilities, test retest tends to be in the 80s. So not as high as the test altogether, which kind of makes sense, right? Because the IQ test, if you count all 15 subtests, right, you're more likely to have reliable findings because you're really measuring something accurately, right? And then if you're measuring something accurately, you have strong validity, you're more likely to have stronger reliability. Whereas the subtests, right, you're kind of chopping that down, but still they're pretty high. The reliabilities on test retests are in the 80s, the internal reliability between the 70s and the 90s. Okay, this I think we can bypass. And with that, that ends part 1 of chapter 8. Yeah, so let me get out of this and we will continue with part 2. So let me pull this up here. Let me pause right here actually for a moment. Okay, I'm back. Thank you for your patience. And with that, why don't we move along? Let me call up my screen. And call up part 2. All righty, continuing our discussion about individual tests of cognitive abilities. So we just completed our discussion about the WAIS, right, which is the big kahuna, the one most used for IQ testing. And we saw the different types of IQ and the different subtests of the WAIS. Okay, I'd like to talk with you about some other individual tests of cognitive abilities. Yeah, and they tend to be shorter and answer more specific questions about mental functions. Yeah, but these are the ones that you commonly will run into. Okay, the first is the P-Body Picture Vocabulary Test, or PPVT. It's in its third edition, and it is very simple. What the person is presented is kind of a flip chart of pictures, of pages. On each page, the page is broken up into 4 blocks or 4 frames. Within each frame is a picture. And the test administration is simply goes like this. The examiner tells the examinee, I'm going to say a word, and I want you to select which of the 4 panels or pictures is the word or represents the word. Alrighty, it's very simple, right? The person doesn't have to even say anything. They just point based on what the word they hear, their understanding of the word, and they point to the picture that best represents the word. Now, this test is, first of all, is actually even as simple a task as that is, as a test, it's highly correlated with overall IQ. Now, it's not a substitute for the IQ test because it is kind of a rough measure, yeah, as you kind of got a sense of, right? It measures vocabulary, and then as expressed in one way, right? You're hearing the word, comprehending it, and then identifying the picture that most represents that word. That said, it's really interesting how just that ability is highly correlated with overall IQ. Alrighty. It's also particularly indicated if you think you're dealing with an examinee or patient who is suffering from expressive aphasia, yeah, which is the inability to express words, okay, or find the words that one wants to, that one is thinking about. Okay. It's also kind of good if you think that you might you might have client or examinee before you for whom English is their second language. Okay, but if you still want or need some kind of rough measure of overall intellectual functioning, right? Because they know English, but it's the second or third language, you can use the PPVT to get a rough estimate. Now, basically what you do is that you score them for, they're about over 100, I think about 150 pages that you go through, but then you stop after a certain number of errors. I think it's about like 4 or 5 consecutive errors you stop, so you don't go through all 150 slides. Then you get a raw score for all the correct answers, which is standard. Then you convert it to a standard score, and then you can apply to norms to see how they're functioning. The PPVT has demonstrated high correlations with lengthier measures of intelligence, as just mentioned. So it's kind of good as a general, quick, dirty measure of overall intellectual functioning, and for the other reasons just mentioned. Yeah, so here's a classic page from it. The examiner would say, so the word is bus. Yeah, which picture is representative of the word bus? And they would point to picture 4, right? And so on. So we'll get through the rest of these probably when we meet face to face. But let's just move on to another test of mental ability, the Wechsler memory scale. Okay. Now, this is not a measure of, this is not a substitute for IQ, but it is a measure of a mental ability, particularly specifically memory, as kind of given away by the title. But the reason why we are talking about the Wechsler memory scale, or WMSE, as known kind of informally, is because this is an important test for the psychologist, if not to have in his chest of psychological tests, at least to be familiar with it, because of all the kinds of cognitive problems that a psychologist may encounter or get as a referral. Probably the most common are memory difficulties. Yeah, you may get a referral based on attention or concentration or organization or planning, and so on. All right, those other cognitive functions. But usually the thing that bothers people the most is when they really feel like they're having difficulty with their memory. Yeah, certainly memory for things such as recipes or things related to work, but certainly if they're running into problems like finding, getting to certain locations that they used to be able to get to. So this is probably the most common neuropsychological referral question. And the most common test administered is the Wechsler memory scale. Now, the way it's structured, it can measure both short-term and a longer-term memory. So that's one. It also makes a distinction between auditory versus visual memory. So memory for things that they hear, okay, logical memory, as well as visual memory, right? Seeing a picture and being able to reproduce it. As mentioned before, It measures two types of memory: immediate memory, and as defined in the whimsy, that's a memory for something experienced a few seconds prior, as well as delayed memory. Yeah, so being able to remember something that was experienced about 30 minutes prior. So this is an example of the auditory memory task. You would read a passage to someone, much like this, right? They'd hear it, right? They don't see this. You read it to them, and then you tell them to tell you orally, right? How to describe as many things as they remember from the passage you just read to them. Right? So they get different points depending on what they remember, how accurately they remember it, and so on. Yeah, this is a very sensitive test to memory problems. Another one, as I mentioned before, is visual memory. So the examinee is given this picture, and I believe they get to see it for about 10 seconds. Then it's removed, and then they reproduce it from memory. Okay. Now, in both situations, right, they reproduce or they say what they remember within a few seconds after the passage is read or after the removal of the visual stimulus. They are also asked to reproduce these things about 30 minutes later. Okay, oof, you can imagine how tough a task that can be. Usually what happens is that between the initial presentation, right, and the immediate recall test, they'll go through some other tests, which take about 30 minutes. And then at that point, the examiner says, oh, remember those pictures or remember that passage I read to you? Could you tell me, or could you write out, could you draw what I had shown you or what I had read off to you 30 minutes prior? Oof, tough test. But there's a lot of variability in terms of how much people can remember in terms of auditory information as well as visual information. Okay, we'll go take a look at those maybe when we meet face to face. Now, what are the psychometric characteristics of the whimsy? Okay, not as reliable as the WAIS-3 subtest. Yeah, probably reliability is more like in the 70s and 80s. Yeah, but the validity data are fairly strong in the 80s and 90s for the whimsy's ability to distinguish those who are suffering from neurological problems versus those who aren't. Okay, and with that, that's all I have to say about Chapter 8 and tests and cognitive abilities, individual tests of cognitive abilities, and next chapter will be on group tests of cognitive abilities. But with that, that's it for Chapter 8. And again, thank you for the privilege of your time. And I will see you the next time we meet. You'll see me also again with the next YouTube video. All right, you have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.